Welcome to our annual conference on the Solicitors qualifying examination. Now we have 3 sessions today, and the first session, well, this is going to be looking at how the first year implementation of the SQE has gone, what went well, what could have gone better, and we're going to also have a bit of an update on some of the recent assessments, and we're going to look ahead to some next steps. Then session number 2, we're going to dig into more detail on the 2 assessments. For instance, how people did in different areas of law, some advice and tips around using sample questions, and also some common answers to typical candidate questions. And then in the third and final session this afternoon, we're going to be covering qualifying work experience. How's that bedding in, common queries, and we're also going to hear from both a law firm and a law clinic about their experience. So we've had lots of questions in advance. In particular, we've had loads of questions about qualifying work experience, and we will be picking those up, but we will be picking, for instance, the qualifying work experience questions up in the third session today. You'll also be able to ask live questions. Have a look at the link below, click on it, and you can submit your questions. You can do that anonymously. We always like to know your name, so you can put your name on there, but you don't have to. And again, we'll try and pick up as many of those as we can throughout this session. Now, I'm delighted to be joined by Julie, Jeff, Zoe and Maxine today. And we're going to kick off by hearing from Julie, who's Julie Swan, who's from the SRA. And she very much leads on the SQE here at the SRA. And I wanted to hear from Julie about, well, how the first year has gone. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you, Ben. Good morning, and thanks to everybody for joining us today as we take stock of the first year of the SQE in practice. Now, I only took up post in July last year, July 2022, by which time, as the recruitment consultants put it, most of the heavy lifting on the SQE had already been done. So as we look back at the first year of the SQE, it would be remiss of me not to pay tribute to my predecessor, Julie Brannan, and to the rest of the SRA's education and training team for getting the SQE successfully launched. Now, it's the publication last week of the first annual report on the SQE that's the trigger for today's event. The report covers the assessments that were taken and for which results were released during the academic year 2021 to 2022. During this time, over 3,000 individual candidates received results for the Solicitors qualifying exam. Results for 2 further assessments have been released since that time, for October 2022's SQE2 and for January 2023's SQE1. The January 2023 assessment alone was taken by about 3,000 candidates, and all the signs are that the take-up of the SQE will grow rapidly this year and into next and beyond. So during this morning, we're going to look back both at the assessments that have already been taken and forward to what's to come. The SQE was, of course, introduced to provide assurance that all newly qualified solicitors are assessed in the same way against the same standard. I think that most candidates who have taken the assessment so far would say that it's a demanding standard. It's a demanding assessment, as it should be. A candidate who passes the SQE is at the gateway to admission to the role of solicitors and a career in practice, during which a wide range of people will put their trust in them, confident that they have the knowledge and skills to help them resolve a legal problem or progress a transaction. The purpose of the assessment is, of course, to differentiate between candidates who have and those who have not yet demonstrated their competence to practice as a day one solicitor. Now, developing assessments that can fairly and reliably differentiate between candidates in this way requires considerable expertise. It's not straightforward, and it's really reassuring that the SQE independent reviewer, Jeff Coombs, who we'll be hearing from shortly, has concluded that the public can be confident the assessments are doing what they should do and doing so fairly. If you've read our own quality assurance report, you'll have seen the care taken to make sure the assessments are valid and reliable and fair to candidates. But I appreciate that the functioning of assessments is technical. It's a bit under the bonnet. Candidates will rightly assume that the assessments are well designed and functioning well. Their perceptions of the assessment will be shaped more by their experience of taking them, how challenging they found them, and the environment in which they sat the assessments. Now, I've made sure since I've joined the SRA to go out to some centres to observe the assessments that are taking place. I've seen both written and oral assessments, and it's really good for me to see candidates, real candidates, turning up to take the assessments. Kaplan also seeks feedback from candidates after each assessment and invites those who wish to discuss their experience to focus groups. Now, the centres I visited were well managed. The environments were conducive to high-stake assessments, such as the SQE. But I know from candidate feedback that there has been a range of experiences. We also, of course, had a well-reported failure at one centre last July, from which we learned some test centres have been removed from the list. But we've also heard from candidates that they want to be able to take assessments at a location that's convenient for them, that's close to home, and that's completely understandable. Taking exams is stressful. No one wants the added stress or cost of travelling to an assessment centre that's far from home. So there will inevitably be a balance to be struck between the convenience and the number and locations of the centres and their quality. But we'll continue to focus on the assessment environment as we prepare for the expected growth in take-up. One of the benefits of a central assessment is the extent and the quality of the data it allows us to capture. If you've been reading the statistical reports published after each sitting, or if you've read the annual report, you'll see that broadly, males and females have performed similarly, with males outperforming females on some sittings, with this reverse for others. Candidates who've told us they're disabled have performed better in some of the assessments than those who haven't declared a disability, and less well in other assessments. The clearest predictor of how a candidate will perform is their prior academic attainment. Candidates with a higher class degree perform better than those with a lower class degree, for example. Differences in performance between candidates of different ethnic groups, differences that predate the SQE remain, with white candidates generally performing better than candidates of other ethnicities, and black British candidates performing least well. Now, this is something that we anticipated could happen. We've had in a question from Sunit asking us what we're going to do about the differences in the performance. Well, the psychometric analyses that are undertaken after each assessment have given us the assurance that we need that the assessments overall and the questions and the tasks within them aren't biased in favour or against candidates because of their particular characteristics. We've not yet published the outcomes of the multivariate analysis that in due course will help us understand more about the factors that influence a candidate's likely performance in the assessments. The reasons we haven't yet published multivariate analysis outcomes are explained in the annual report, but basically we don't yet have enough data to enable reliable conclusions to be drawn. But, and this is in the annual report, there are indications that the differences in performance between different groups of candidates, including by ethnicity, can be explained by prior educational and socioeconomic factors. We're hoping the research we've commissioned from Exeter University will help us better understand what's going on here. But to be honest, we don't expect this will find one simple cause, nor therefore lead us to one simple solution. So far as you will have seen, apprentices have performed very well, and incidentally there's an extended article in the Times today looking at how solicitors apprentices are taking off and reporting on some firms' very positive experience of this initiative. Now, we wanted through the SQE to remove unnecessary regulatory barriers to qualification. It will be some time before we will be able to tell the impact this will have on the diversity of the profession, but the signs so far are promising. We held a webinar for candidates at the start of this month. It's available to view on our website. We had 4 great contributors, each with different backgrounds, but they all commented that the SQE had opened up for them opportunities to qualify in an affordable way that they felt wouldn't have been available for them under the old LPC route. The training market is developing. We've published the outcomes of a survey we've undertaken of training providers. This illustrates the variety of ways in which SQE candidates can study. There are fully face-to-face and fully remote options, as well as hybrid models. There are courses intended solely to prepare candidates for the SQE and programmes that integrate SQE preparation into courses leading to an academic award, such as a master's degree. We've had in a question from someone who's taken the LPC and who wants to know whether there are courses that prepare candidates just to take SQE too. Yes, there are. We've also had questions asking whether it's possible to self-study. Well, yes, it is. I'm not going to suggest that that would be an easy route, but there's no obligation on any candidate to attend a course before attempting an assessment. And some providers are making available for purchase materials to help candidates who choose to study in that way. Of course, the range of fees that are charged for these courses is very wide and variable too. As the data set of candidates' performance grows, we will in time publish information to help candidates identify the training options that might be best for them. Now, before I finish and hand back to Ben, I just want to say something about the SQE fees. As you might have seen, the fees for taking the SQE will be going up for the next academic year. They're going up in line with inflation. So for the next academic year, 2023-2024, the fees will be for SQE1, 1,798, and for SQE2, 2,766. Of course, we all wish the fee increase wasn't necessary, but we aren't immune from the pressures in the economy generally. So to conclude, from my perspective, the first year of the SQE has been a success. We've learned lessons about the delivery of the assessments. We recognise the assessment is tough. We are pleased candidates are starting to qualify in numbers through the SQE, and you'll have an opportunity to hear throughout the rest of the day how the assessments have performed, how candidates have performed, and hopefully take away some useful information that will support you as a training provider, as a firm, or indeed as a candidate. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the session, and back to Ben. I hear you, Ben.
So there we go. There's the first failure of the day, not being on mute, which is doubly bad when you're chairing. But anyway, no, thank you, Julie. That's really interesting, though I'm sure some of our viewers might be thinking, well, of course, the SRA is going to probably say that things are going pretty well. So we thought it would be helpful to hear from the SQE's independent reviewer, and independent reviewer is very much what it says on the tin. Jeff, our independent reviewer, is here to look at how the SQE is going and how it's being implemented. So, Jeff, over to you to tell us about what's your view of the first year.
Thanks very much, Ben. Good morning, everyone. Yes, I'm Jeff Coombe. I'm the independent reviewer. So I'd like to just share with you some of my reflections of my work over the past 12 to 18 months. But before I do that, let me just give you a quick overview of how I go about my work and what it involves. So essentially, my role is to provide external assurance to the SRA and to their exam services provider, CAPLAN, that the SQE is fair, defensible, and will command public confidence. So I go about that work by conducting interviews with senior staff at CAPLAN and at the SRA, meeting with assessors. I have a lot of direct observation, so I've observed a lot of the exam conduct over the past 18 months or so, including where live candidates are present. I review management information and reports, and I use all that information to put together my reports. I've been involved since 2019, which means that I was party to the design decisions that went into how the SQE assessment was put together. And I was also party to the pilot activity that took place prior to the live operation of the SQE. And I've provided a series of reports over the years on each of those activities, including the first live sitting of SQE1 and SQE2. And my first annual report was published last week. And from now on, I'll be in a cycle of providing an annual report. So let's just look at how things have gone so far. So from my perspective, the first 18 months, given that the SQE requires complex and demanding assessment arrangements, and these operate in a high stakes context, the initial 18 months of delivery have generally been good. I'm confident that the outcomes are fair and reliable for candidates. And, as Julie has mentioned, there have been some operational issues. And to my mind, the key to dealing with those operational issues is to have the candidate's interests at the heart of any remedial action that's necessary. There is a thorough lessons learnt process in place, both with the SRA and with CAPLAN and together. And I've already observed the outcomes of lessons learnt from the early sessions being implemented and seen improvements made, and I know further improvements are in the pipeline. I predict that the SQE will be under future scrutiny, and I will say a bit more about that in a few moments. So I think overall the SQE has started well, and that's mainly due to the effective piloting, the good planning, and using processes that have been shown to be effective in similar high-stakes professional qualifications which lead to a license to practice. Some aspects of delivery are already excellent. So, for example, the psychometric support that is used to determine and maintain standards and assure that the assessments are performed effectively from a technical perspective has worked really well. Also, the work that CAPLAN do to seek feedback from candidates after each of the exam sessions, after SQE1 and SQE2, is also very good. The approach taken to set the SQE standards is also good. A standards advisory group has been set up to offer advice and support to the exam board, and the psychometric reporting to those groups is consistently comprehensive and of a high quality. And that enables the exam board to have confidence in the pass marks that are being put forward. CAPLAN and the SRA have good quality assurance safeguards in place, and the approach taken with capturing and prioritising actions arising from lessons learned is thorough. So it started well, but that's not to say there haven't been some challenges that have needed some responses. So I'll just remind you of the context. We've got a brand new, complex, high stakes exam. So it wasn't surprising to me that there were some operational issues that have arisen. I've worked in the exams industry for 30 years. And when you're dealing with a situation such as this, where you have exams operating in 42 countries and in hundreds of test centres, it is almost inevitable there will be some operational issues. And unfortunately, a few of those issues did adversely affect a minority of candidates. Now, when operational issues have occurred, the reaction has been effective. So, for example, in the test centre failure that Julie mentioned a few moments ago, that incident took the remedial action took a candidate-centred approach, treating each candidate as an individual when working out the best course of action to take. And I have observed that the attitude and the culture surrounding learning lessons from issues arising is positive, and I'm absolutely certain that the relevant teams in CAPLAN and the SRA are truly committed to learning and improving as each session goes by. Just want to say something about the scrutiny that I believe the SQE will be put under. I suspect that will increase, and there may be increased challenge over the coming year or two. And I think that challenge is most likely to come from candidates that are at risk of failing their third attempt at SQE1 or SQE2, and therefore being time barred from continuing. And it's also possible that groups representing candidates that feel they shouldn't have failed may also encourage their candidates to make more mitigating circumstances or appeals. Now, in this situation, it's really important, if there's an increase in the demand for mitigating circumstances or appeals, that the group of people that are involved in dealing with those complex requests have the resources available and can take a consistent approach, and that if there are spurious cases put forward, those can be refuted efficiently and effectively, but that the interests of candidates are protected where they have a genuine case. And that is an area where it's not unusual for new exams to come under greater pressure as the pressure ramps up on candidates involved seeking to pass the exam. So it's an area where I want to investigate more over the next year or so. But I want to just leave you with my sort of overall summary, my overall conclusion, which is that a good start has been made. There's absolutely no room for complacency. I've seen no sense that there is any complacency, but that the initial outcomes of the SQE do appear fair, defensible, and reliable. Thank you. Thanks, Ben.
Thank you, Jeff. That was really helpful. So let's move on to hearing from our assessment provider, Kaplan. A reminder that when the SRA went ahead to implementing the SQE, we needed to recruit a sort of leading expert, technical expert in delivering assessments. And we recruited Kaplan, who do this internationally across lots of different assessments across the world. So I'm delighted to be joined by Zoe Robinson from Kaplan to talk through how they feel things have gone. And I've got some questions that are coming that I'll also be asking as we go along. But perhaps I could kick off, Zoe, by just getting you to reflect on how have things been going from your perspective.
Yeah, good morning, Ben, and good morning to everybody watching. Yeah, thanks for the question. I think overall we're very happy with how the assessments have gone so far, and we're delighted that both the SRA and Jeff in his independent reviewer position share that view. In Jeff's report, and Julie's made reference as well to the fact that the belief is very firmly that the outcomes delivered were fair and reliable. And indeed, the annual report does contain some previously unpublished statistics regarding test reliability. So if you've read the report, you will have seen reference to something known as the Cronbach's alpha and standard error of measurement. So these statistics are both key statistics regarding test reliability, and we're delighted that they've both been consistently well above the widely accepted gold standard measures for high stakes assessments. So that's really important to us as an assessment provider. Delivering fair and reliable assessments is arguably our main objective, so we're really pleased with those outcomes.
Well, while I manically Google Cronbach's alpha, but I think you explained it's sort of a test of how reliable an assessment is, and the SQE is doing well and comparing well internationally on that basis. One thing I wanted to pick up was around Julie's comments around apprentices performing well. Do you have any thoughts on why that may be the case, while recognising it's still quite a small sample in terms of the numbers so far?
Yeah, you're right. It is a small proportion of the overall candidate numbers that we've seen so far that have been apprentices. But that said, SQE1 and SQE2 apprentices have gained marks that were on average 8% higher than other candidates. And in particular, I mean, we can go back to the April 22 SQE2, where the apprentices had a 100% pass rate, which really is spectacular. I think this really bodes well for the future success of the solicitor apprenticeship as a route into the profession. At this stage, we can only speculate really as to what might be driving those higher pass rates. But one potential explanation could be that they've had quite extensive work experience before taking SQE2 in particular. So I think that's going to be really interesting to monitor and see how those apprenticeship pass rates stack up in future sittings.
And I suppose it would be remiss of me not to miss the opportunity here to cross promote the fact we've got lots of webinars on our YouTube channel about taking apprenticeships. So if anyone's interested in more detail of that, including hearing from apprentices, look on our YouTube channel for that. But perhaps I could come to this question around the attainment gap. And Julie's covered off some of the things we're doing about that. But maybe I could ask you a bit more about how do we collect the data, as part of this work and to inform our insights?
Yeah, sure. And this is really important to us being able to, gain insight from this data. So the process is that candidates have to complete an online survey called a Monitoring and Maximising Diversity Survey. They do that before they make every assessment booking. And it's that data that we use to produce the information that we publish regarding pass rates relating to the various demographic aspects. As more candidates take the assessment, we should have better data to start drawing further insights, as Julie has already made reference to. And indeed, that is one of the benefits of having a centralised assessment regime. It's vitally important to the wider project of looking at the diversity of the profession. However, what we have observed is that almost half of candidates, so 47% of candidates, are selecting prefer not to say for at least one or more of the 14 characteristics that are detailed out within the annual report, and that significantly limits the value of the analysis that we can do. We can be performing on the data. So we'd really encourage all candidates to respond as completely as they are comfortable doing. And I think it's worthwhile reassuring candidates that all of the data that we do collect via that survey is all kept completely confidential, and it's fully anonymised before it's ever shared with the SRA. So I think that's trying to encourage that sort of more complete reporting of that data would be fantastic. And I'd also like to encourage candidates to thoroughly review the questions ahead of each booking. So we have attempted to make it a bit easier for people by pre-populating based on previous answers provided, on the basis that many of those questions, the responses won't change. But for some of them, we would expect your responses to change over time. So, for example, questions like whether you've undertaken any qualifying work experience, or aspects relating to your tuition provision, for example. So please do take the time to review that ahead of each assessment window and each booking that you make. Accurate and complete data sets are really going to bring benefits to everyone in this whole process, whether that's candidates seeking to make decisions on the basis of information published, whether that's in trying to understand what key drivers might be in some of the attainment gaps that we're seeing. Lots of benefits, and we just encourage more accurate and complete data as far as possible.
And on that point, Zoe, sorry, I was just going to say, yeah, because what we want to do is this multivariate or sort of overlapping analysis, isn't it, to try and work out, is it multiple factors? So it might be gender, age and ethnicity and prior academic background are actually all interact as to factors as to how people perform. And there's one other area, isn't there, that we're looking at in terms of, or we thought about adding a question in terms of what language people speak. Is that right?
Yeah, we have recently enhanced the survey, adding in a new question about English as an additional language, and that will further enrich the data coming through. We've also amended the questions relating to training provision. So candidates now have to select from sort of drop-down lists to tell us about which provider they've used, if they have, and what sort of course they have undertaken with that provider.
Now, one, I suppose, interesting thing that has come out of the reports we published is that pass rates for SQE1 in July last year were significantly lower for resitting candidates than they were for candidates who were doing their first attempt. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's perhaps not surprising, but pass rates for those second attempt candidates in July were low. I think it was something like 16-17% for FLK1 and about 27% for FLK2. One reflection is that we saw a relatively large proportion of candidates resitting SQE1 at the first available opportunity. So 45% of those candidates who failed in November went on to resit at the immediate next sitting in July. We've actually done a deeper analysis that we conducted on the more recent January 2023 SQE1 assessments, and that has shown that those candidates resitting both FLK1 and FLK2 quickly will frequently fail again, versus those that may be resitting just one of the SQE1 assessments. So the pass rates that we saw for those just resitting one were not significantly different to the overall pass rate. So I think those observations might indicate that resit candidates may want to consider just taking a little bit more time, and I suppose with that comes the assumption of doing a little bit more work or undertaking a bit more training between those sittings, especially if they're needing to reattempt both of the SQE1 assessments. That may really help them to improve from the failing to passing standard.
Thank you. And both Julie and Jeff have mentioned some of the issues that arose during delivery of the assessment, even if generally things went well. What's Kaplan's take on that?
Yeah, Jeff made a good reference to our lessons learned process, and just to reassure everybody, I suppose, that of course there are areas that we need to improve on, and we don't take those things lightly, and we're not standing still on any aspect of the SQE. There is a section in the annual report about feedback and continuous improvement, which sets out some of the areas where we've already made improvements or where we're continuing to put in work. Some of those do relate to aspects around the delivery of the assessments, but some focus on other areas. So, for example, reducing the time taken to release the SQE1 results, which training providers and candidates had asked for. We continue to work on further improvements, such as looking, for example, at the time taken to confirm bookings for candidates with reasonable adjustments. And we would continue to encourage all candidates to share their feedback with us using the candidate satisfaction survey that's sent to them at the end of each assessment.
Now, since the period covered in the annual report, there's been a couple of further assessments. Shall we start with the SQE one that happened in January? What are the insights from that?
Yeah, sure. So we released the results for the January SQE1 just over a week ago on the 14th of March. We had 3,334 candidates who actually attempted one of the papers there. Pass marks, so I think we've got a slide here that just shows the pass marks relative to the other SQE1 sittings we've had. So you can see they were very consistent with the last two sittings, and the full statistical report will be released by the end of the month for that exam. It's worthwhile just reiterating, I think, with those pass marks there, that there is no predetermined static or fixed pass rate or pass mark for any of the SQE assessments. It's about competence. That's the important thing. The pass mark is determined for each exam, and that's based on the difficulty of the questions within that exam. And then the pass rate falls out of that and is driven by each individual cohort. The overall sort of objective and rule, if you meet the standard, you will pass.
Okay, and so let's move on to another question about SQE1. One question we get asked is whether there will be a further SQE1 sitting introduced. That's in addition to the January and July sittings that already happen. Are there plans for that?
At the moment, no, there are no plans to do that. We do know and understand that some stakeholders, in particular training providers, have asked about this, and we will continue to keep it under review. But what we are focusing on at the moment is the scaling of the two sittings that we are offering. So from 2024, we will have more assessment days within an SQE1 assessment window in order to meet that expected higher demand. So some of you will have seen the dates that have now been published on the website earlier on this week. So you can see that we will have a couple of FLK1 days that may even increase to 3 or perhaps even all 5 days running in week 1. And then FLK2 will run the following week with again 2, 3, maybe up to 5 days in that week. This move has also allowed us to respond to candidate feedback that was coming through loud and clear about the intensity of the exams, and that perhaps some candidates might be wanting a longer gap between FLK1 and FLK2. And this way of structuring the assessment window will allow those who want that longer gap to be able to take it. So yeah, have a look at those dates on the website.
Thanks, Zoe, and thank you for those who are putting in questions. I see we've got a few questions coming in around issues around capacity and booking, so we'll come back to that issue in a bit Zoe. But
Okay.
just for the moment, obviously there was also an SQE2 that happened last October. What can you tell us about that? That was the second ever SQE2 sitting.
Yeah, second ever. So the results for that came out at the very end of February. 646 candidates in total. And again, I think we've got a slide just showing the pass mark and pass rates, which really just emphasises the point I was making before about there not being any predetermined pass mark or pass rate. Yeah, I think overall that sitting went well. We were pleased with it, and we are now gearing up for the third SQE2 sitting at the end of April, early May.
And I think the calendar starts to get pretty busy as we move onto sort of more regular assessment timetable. Do you want to remind people what the process is there? And I think we have another slide because there's quite a bit of detail there.
Yeah, third and final slide, but definitely one worthwhile having a look at because there's a lot of detail here. You're right, it does start to get quite busy. So that SQE2 sitting I mentioned in April, the booking window is still open until 5 p.m. this evening. There are still seats left available. So if anybody is intending on sitting their SQE2 in April, then you've got a few hours still to get booked on. And it's interesting and worthwhile noting that we will be moving to quarterly sittings from sort of here on out. So we'll have two further windows for SQE2 in 2023 in July and October, followed by our first ever January SQE2 sitting in Jan 24. Couple of other things worthwhile flagging. So from October this year, we're going to be adding a new venue in Birmingham. We're just finalising the details on that now, and we'll be publishing more information shortly. And also for Welsh candidates, it's worthwhile noting that the October sitting will be the first time that we will be offering SQE2 fully in the medium of Welsh. So that will be questions translated into Welsh, as well as candidates having the ability to answer in Welsh.
Thanks, Zoe. We're getting quite a few questions through around SQE2, and this demand for that is going to increase into 2024 and beyond. So we get questions on themes of, the length of the assessment window and the order in which candidates can take assessments. So some people are asking, is it the written one first, or is it the oral assessment first, or is there any particular order? Is there anything you can clarify on that?
Yeah, of course. So currently SQE2, the assessment window runs over a sort of 2 to 3 week assessment period. And in 2024, we expect that that's going to continue, although the windows are probably more likely to be at the 3-week level rather than the 2-week level. And as candidate volumes do increase throughout 24 into 2025, we may see that extending into 4 weeks, possibly even 5 weeks. But at this stage, we don't really see them extending beyond that length. And in terms of order, there is no fixed order as to whether the oral assessments or the written assessments will come first. The order is largely determined by our seat sourcing considerations as we seek to maximise the number of spaces available for candidates. So sometimes the written will come first, sometimes the oral might come first. We could even have a situation, we haven't yet, but we could even have a situation where the written sits in the middle and there's a week of oral and then a week of written and then a week of oral assessments. So that's how, we don't see that's going to change or sort of cement down at any point soon, because really having the maximum number of spaces available for candidates is the most important thing.
Thanks, Zoe. And we've got quite a few questions come in, so I wanted to pick up a few of them before we then go to Maxine, who's going to talk about the perception survey. So one, we've had quite a few questions around capacity. And somebody's asked that basically they couldn't get in a test centre that was as close to where they sort of lived or wanted to get one, so they had to travel. And they've asked us, are we going to consider remote assessments? And Zoe, maybe you want to answer that, but maybe Julie, you might want to come in as well.
Yeah, I mean, remote assessments are very challenging from a security perspective, and I don't know how many people may have thought of the recent advancements around things like ChatGPT in the context of assessments, but it won't surprise people that it has sort of really put a bit of a furore amongst the assessment community. And therefore the importance of security in order to ensure that we've got those fair, reliable exams is all the more important. So we're not envisaging a wide scale rollout of remote assessments at any point soon. No, it is possible for candidates who might require some form of reasonable adjustment to be able to sit the exam remotely. And we do also have contingency options that would incorporate some form of remote delivery. But for mainstream delivery, it is unlikely.
Julie, did you want to add in anything on that question?
Thanks. I think Zoe's covered the main points. I would just add that if we went to remote proctoring arrangements, don't assume it would be cheaper, because you need a lot of invigilators, more invigilators than you need for an exam centre, which comes at a cost. Candidates would be in very different environments with very different IT support and reliability, which could be problematic. And at least in a centre, if you have got a technical issue, there is somebody on hand to help you. So as Zoe says, available if necessary in extremis, or available as a remote, as a reasonable adjustment, but we're not planning to roll it out en masse.
Now, we've had another question about, I think booking opened yesterday for SQE assessments, and I think there was a reasonably long queue or volume of people, and we've had a question about the experience of someone who's an apprentice saying they had a long wait. It's a pretty sort of frustrating, stressful process. Zoe, what's your thoughts on that, and is there anything sort of we can do to improve that?
Yeah, well, we did have the busiest day of bookings yesterday that we've seen so far, with over 2,500 candidate bookings taking place. In terms of locations, if candidates aren't doing this already, then I'd encourage candidates to go back and look at centres available on the booking page of their account. They can use the postcode function to help them search there. They can also call the candidate services team if they need help, and they can also help with the search once they are into the site. We do have access to a wide network of test centres via Pearson, our test centre provider, and sometimes some test centres do get booked, as there's naturally a limited amount of spaces. We find that quite a few candidates book a seat and then are able to move to a different location later on, and so periodically checking back in is worthwhile. In terms of the queuing system, we put the queuing system in place to allow for fair access to the booking process. A lot of candidates do log in at the beginning of the booking window, which does ultimately lead to long wait times at that point, and we did see that yesterday. But what our data is showing us is that a number of candidates do log in with multiple devices or on multiple windows, and that does significantly add to the length of the queue, and as then people sort of filter through. So
people are effectively queuing behind themselves then.
Yeah,
almost.
Kind of, in a way.
Yeah.
Exactly, yes.
Okay, and then another question for you, Zoe, and I think this is a common question, and I know we've had quite a bit of feedback on this, the issue of water in the test centres and why candidates can't bring their own water into the exam.
Yeah, I mean, it's purely a practical reason, really. I suppose two levels. Firstly, for the protection of the equipment. These are computer-based exams, and if somebody accidentally knocks a whole bottle of water over onto the equipment, then that's going to wipe out their ability to take the assessment. So there is that very practical basis there. There's also other sort of vague security reasons and things like that. So we did put a change through that does allow a candidate to be able to access water if they need to on an unscheduled break. So it isn't that they can't have access to water whatsoever, and we just encourage candidates to sort of plan accordingly, really, for that.
And we've got a question in, thank you to Byron from Cardiff, who's asked about do we anticipate any changes to the SQE1 and SQE2 assessment specifications in the near future?
Yeah, so we're currently completing our first annual review of the FLK and the assessment specifications. We went out and sought questions and input from stakeholders, and that the deadline for that input was the end of February. And we will be publishing an updated FLK and assessment specifications by the end of April, letting stakeholders know about any key changes via the website. We're also planning a meeting with training providers around that time as well. To be clear, the updated FLK will apply to any assessments taking place after the 1st of September. So they're not immediately going to come in, even though we're publishing at the end of April. At this stage, we're not anticipating any major changes. I think the main change that we will be adding more clarity around will be how candidates need to take account of Welsh law. So you can expect a few updates on that.
We've also had a question about booking window dates for SQE sittings in 2024. I think the simple answer on that is the ones we have been published. They're on the SQE website, and the remaining ones will be published as soon as possible. And then just one final question for you, Zoe, was somebody's asked, can I take a break between passing SQE1 and SQE2? For instance, could I go travelling for a year, which sounds lovely, before sitting SQE2? And I think the answer to that is definitely yes. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. That there's no sort of absolute restrictions on the progression from S1 to S2. In fact, actually taking a break might be something that candidates want to positively think about doing, particularly if it's to undertake some of their qualifying work experience in the time between S1 and S2. I think we are seeing evidence that those with qualifying work experience are performing better on the SQE2 assessments. So that's something to consider. Clearly, going travelling isn't necessarily going to buy you that advantage, but there's no disadvantage to it either. We just need to be thinking about, or just be mindful of the fact that there is that total time limit of 6 years in order to get through. So just bear that in mind. If you're going to go off travelling for 3 or 4 years, then you might be cutting it a little bit fine if you were to then have any difficulties on SQE2.
I've just seen, thank you, Byron, again for another question or comment asking, can we have an April SQE1? I think Zoe's already dealt with that one in the sense there aren't actually plans for that. We get a lot of different feedback on what dates would work for some people and not for others, and there is a balancing act there. We may be able to get through a couple more questions before this webinar finishes, but I'm aware we've got one more topic I'd like to get through. So thank you, Zoe, for being put on the spot there and
no problem.
Hopefully answering people's questions. But now I'd like to come to Maxine, who's from the SRA, and she was leading on a perception survey we did about both the SQE and qualifying work experience. So Maxine, do you want to tell us a little bit about what was the purpose of doing that survey?
Yes, thank you, Ben, and good morning, everybody. Well, obviously, when you've got a change on the scale of the SQE, it's really important that you have a really robust evaluation programme in place. And whilst we do have this 10-year evaluation programme in place, it's too early really at this stage to really assess the impact of the SQE. But we didn't want to wait until we started our proper formal evaluations before at least getting some kind of sense about what people think about the SQE and how it's working. So the purpose of the perception study really was just to get an initial snapshot view about what people think is working well and any areas where maybe they need a little bit more support and where we could help at this stage.
And so then there's this 10-year programme of evaluation. So this is an initial snapshot. What does the 10-year sort of plan involve?
Yeah, so the 10-year plan will include a number of independent formal evaluations at year 3 and again at year 5 and again at year 7 to 10. And we'll be looking at those stages at full independent market study of the changes, And also at year 5, we will do a technical evaluation of the SQE assessment. But as I've already said, we can't do that yet because it's too early to actually see what impact the changes have had.
So who was this initial survey that we've done, the snapshot one? Who were we asking? Who were we targeting with that?
Yeah, so we were targeting a number of different groups. We were looking obviously to hear from candidates, both candidates who have already taken the assessment, but also candidates who were thinking about taking it. Also firms and anyone employing trainee solicitors we wanted to hear from. And of course, we also wanted to hear from training providers, those who are providing SQE preparatory training and those who are planning to do so. And
how many responses did we get?
Well, luckily we heard from all of those groups that we were targeting, and we had over 550 responses. The majority of the responses, I would say, were from candidates, but we did also hear from law firms, and we had over 35 responses from education and training providers as well.
And what do we know about the respondents? Because presumably they can't be a perfectly representative sample, is that right? Or
no, that's right. So as I say, a large number of the responses, the majority of the responses were from candidates. And we do need to bear in mind that this early cohort of candidates, that's particularly those that have already taken SQE, they're not likely to be representative of the cohort of candidates that we see in the future, because we know, for example, that there are more qualified lawyers in this early candidate than we're likely to see in the future. And there's also some transitional candidates, people transferring from the old LPC system. So we do know that the candidate cohort is not representative of what we might see in the future. So I think in terms of this initial survey, we probably need to be a little bit cautious about over-interpreting the results, because it's not likely to be a representative sample compared to future surveys that we do.
Okay, so let's move on to I suppose the meat of this. What did people say? And let's start with the SQE assessment itself. What were people's views of that?
So we asked a range of questions about the SQE, but the highest scoring question was around consistency of standards. And lots of respondents told us that they thought the SQE would ensure consistent high standards at the point of qualification. And of course, that's really important because that's one of our core objectives of the SQE. And we also had a lot of really positive responses about whether SQE will remove artificial and unjustifiable barriers, which was also a core objective of the SQE. And what was really encouraging is we had quite a few case studies from people who told us that they'd been able to qualify under the SQE route when they hadn't been able to qualify under the old LPC system.
But I imagine everyone wasn't wholly positive, Maxine. So what were the negatives, or let's call it constructive criticism?
No, obviously, lots of really helpful feedback, and there were some concerns raised by the survey respondents. In particular, people were concerned about the cost of studying for the SQE and taking the SQE. In particular, people thought that the combined cost of the SQE assessment plus the SQE training was quite high. But I suppose it is worth noting, Julie's already mentioned it, we have published our own research on this, and we have seen that there's a really good range of courses on the market, but also there's a really good range of prices for preparatory training, some of which are lower than the cost of the LPC. So it is worth having a look at that research and doing some proper research when people are looking at the training market.
So let's move on to qualifying work experience, or QWE as some people call it. What were people's perceptions of that? Has that gone well?
Yeah, so overall on qualifying work experience, we had some really positive responses. People thought that generally the requirements for qualifying work experience for candidates were really clear. There was some evidence of a need for more clarification around what counts as qualifying work experience and the process for confirming qualifying work experience. So we will have a look at that. But overall, very positive responses on qualifying work experience, and on people thought that qualifying work experience would help to promote diversity at the point of entry into the profession.
And had any of the people feeding back actually done qualifying work experience, or was it more theoretical?
Yeah, actually, lots of the candidates who responded had done work experience, and those who had done work experience told us that they'd had a very positive experience. They felt the quality of the work experience that they'd had and the supervision was really of a high standard. We did ask people about how easy or hard they found it to get their qualifying work experience, and there was more of a mixed picture there. Some people said they found it very easy to get qualifying work experience and easier than under the old training contract system, but some people said that because of their particular needs, they wanted to get qualifying work experience in a particular location, for example, or in a particular practice area. Some of them found it a little bit more difficult to find their qualifying work experience.
And I suppose picking up on that point, yeah, what else were people less positive about?
Some people told us that the requirements around the sign-off of work experience might not always have been clear. The candidates that had done work experience, on the whole, the vast majority of them told us that they found it easy to get their work experience signed off. But we had a very small number of respondents who told us that they found it difficult to get their qualifying work experience signed off. And they felt that this was because their employer didn't always understand what they needed to do or what the requirements of the sign-off were. So that's something that we will be looking at. But I suppose on the flip side, employers also told us that they were finding some benefits from qualifying work experience. So we had employer respondents who were telling us that they were pleased with qualifying work experience because it enabled them to bring through their paralegals to qualify as a solicitor. And also we had employers telling us that they were able now to offer training to be a solicitor in a way they couldn't under the old training contract system.
So just to finish off, what are the next steps on this piece of work?
Yep, so we had a lot of really useful feedback, which of course we've looked at all the feedback. We've set out some next steps in the report, which we published on our website. I think the important thing is that we want to continue to talk to people, want to continue to hear what people think about the SQE. We think we've got some more work to do with training providers in particular, who probably answered less positive than other groups in response to the survey. So we will continue to meet with training providers. We do meet with them already, but we will continue to do that and to see whether there's any further support that we can offer to training providers. And we'll look again at our information on our website and our resources, particularly in response to the feedback about qualifying work experience, just to make sure that that the information is as clear as it can be.
Thank you, Maxine. We've got about 3 minutes left. So what I'm going to do is some quick fire questions. I want to try and finish this webinar broadly on time, seeing I was the chair who failed to come off mute at the start. Let's see if I can claw it back. So we'll give very quick answers to these. So firstly, there seems to be some questions that are suggesting that there's no places left to book in the south for SQE1. I just wanted to make clear, we're pretty sure, unless it's changed while we're on this webinar, that there are still places available for that.
There are still places available, yes, specifically London, as I know that's a big demand area. There are still spaces available. There are some centres that are full, undoubtedly, and I'd just reiterate what I said earlier, that if a candidate is still wanting to book and they're struggling to find a location that works for them, please contact our candidate services team and they will help with the search for you.
Thank you, Zoe. Two other quick ones to answer. Firstly, in the advocacy exam, are we examined with another student? I think the answer to that is no.
Nope.
If you do not pass the LPC, but you get a training contract, can you use that training contract to count as qualifying work experience? Come to our session later, but I think the short answer is yes. One for you, Julie. I think there is a question here around, beyond judging training providers on cost, what other information could help people, or candidates select a course provider?
Thank you. Well, we're not authorising course providers. We want course providers to be innovative, to respond to what candidates want, and they are offering, as I said, a variety of measures. I think candidates need to identify what matters to them. Do they want face-to-face tuition? Do they need that? Or are they better able to study independently? When do they want to study? Do they want daytime, evening, weekend, mixture of provision? How important is it for them to have contact directly face-to-face with other students, and so on? Do they want just a standalone preparatory course for the SQE, or do they want also to get a wider academic award? I mentioned that we will, when we've got more data, be publishing information that will help candidates take a decision, but it really is a decision for individuals in terms of what they want and what will work best for them given their circumstances and learning styles.
And again, the SRA has some webinars around sort of things you might want to consider to help inform your choices. Zoe, quick question for you. Someone's asked when we'll know the most recent SQE1 pass rates.
Yeah, I think I mentioned before, the statistical report will be published before the end of the month.
And then another question, I think, quick one for you, Julia, that's a big question, is why do apprentices have to sit SQE1? Why can't they be exempt from that?
Okay, so SQE1 and SQE2 are an essential part of the apprentice standard. If they weren't taking the SQE1 and the SQE2 assessment, we wouldn't know. We wouldn't have that evidence that they were competent to practice. I would also say taking the same assessment that everybody else has taken really does enable an apprentice to say, hey, look, I completed perhaps a less familiar approach to qualifying, but I was assessed in exactly the same way as everybody else. And as Zoe said earlier, and I might have done particularly well, as apprentices generally are.
Thank you. Well, that seems like a good note to finish on as the clock chimes 10:30. I wanted to thank everyone on the call for answering all my questions and the interrogation. I'd also like to thank all those viewers who have joined us, particularly those who asked questions. It's great we had so many. Some of them we haven't been able to cover. For instance, there's quite a few detailed questions around exemptions. We've got a qualified lawyers webinar actually in May that I'd strongly recommend you come to, because there can be quite techie details. All go off to the SRA website. Quite a few questions about qualifying work experience we'll be coming back to later, and some questions about the assessment we're going to be covering in our next session, which starts at 11 o'clock. But I just wanted to finish off by saying there is a link below where you can feed back on this webinar. It'd be really helpful if you do click on it and let us know what you think, what's gone well, what could be improved. You can, if you're coming to all the sessions, you can do that at the end of the day and do it all together. But I appreciate some of you might not be here for all sessions, so it'd be really helpful if you could click on that, spend 1 minute just letting us know what you think. But otherwise, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone, and we look forward to seeing you back here again for our next session at 11 o'clock, which is going to be going into more detail around some of the insights on the assessment and the types of queries candidates have and themes such as sample questions. So thank you very much.